The Nazi warships, on the symbols of terrifying power, now lay in peace. After the surrender of Nazi Germany, the oceans on the ruled by these massive vessels became a reliquit. What happened to the mighty ships that had on the dominated Europe's coastlines? The post-war fate of these giants is a tale of vast numbers, economic struggle, and the quick dismantling of a fleet that had terrified the world. The once-proud Kriegsmarine fleet was now obsolete, and as the world moved on, so did the ships inevitable end. These colossal machines of destruction, now abandoned, were slowly transformed into relics of a bygone era, fate sealed by the ravages of time. The end of World War II marked the beginning of an uncertain, unsettling reality for the once mighty Nazi warships, vessels that had been at the forefront of Hitler's naval ambitions. After the surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945, the seas that had been dominated by the Kriegsmarine were suddenly empty, quiet, and full of uneasy questions. What happened to the massive warships that had once terrorized Europe's coasts and controlled vast stretches of the Atlantic? The answer is far more complicated than many might think. The fate of these ships, these symbols of might, power, and terror, would vary dramatically depending on the political landscape, economic pressures, and the decisions of the Allied forces who inherited the wreckage of the Third Reich's navy. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Nazi warships were not simply abandoned, nor were they dismantled in an instant. They were the victims of an overwhelming sense of surplus, strategic obsolescence, and economic necessity. As Germany lay in ruins, the world struggled to make sense of the global order, and the sheer number of warships now at the Allies' disposal became a logistical burden. Some ships, once considered cutting-edge and fearsome, were suddenly unnecessary. The world had moved on, and the need for such large fleets of battleships and cruisers had diminished. Even in the eyes of the victorious nations, many of the warships from the German Navy had little utility. The scale of the problem was staggering. Germany had built a formidable navy, one that included some of the largest and most advanced warships of the time, such as the Bismarck, the Tirpitz, and the Admiral Hipper. These ships were among the most sophisticated military machines ever constructed. Yet, by the time the war ended, they were no longer viewed as vital to the future of naval warfare. The Allied powers, including the United States and the United Kingdom, had their own powerful fleets, and the massive, aging warships of the Kriegsmarine were increasingly seen as costly liabilities rather than assets. The Bismarck, for instance, had been sunk in 1941, its wreckage barely clinging to the memory of its brief but dramatic career. The Tirpitz, the sister ship of the Bismarck, had been crippled by repeated air raids and ultimately scuttled in Norway. Both of these ships would haunt the minds of those in charge of their post-war disposition, but neither was likely to sail again. Yet many of the remaining ships, including cruisers, destroyers, and even submarines, still held potential. In the years following the war, the fate of these vessels became a matter of intense negotiation, calculation, and, at times, tragic neglect. The sheer number of ships left to be dealt with was immense. By the war's end, the Kriegsmarine boasted more than 200 ships, including over 30 major warships and hundreds of smaller vessels. This incredible surplus posed immediate challenges for the Allied powers. No single nation had the resources to take on these ships entirely, and there was little appetite to maintain fleets that no longer aligned with the strategic priorities of the post-war world. The immediate action was to strip these ships of any remaining useful equipment. Radar, guns, and other valuable technologies were removed and repurposed for use by the victorious nations. The rest of the ships were left to linger in the harbors of Europe, abandoned to the ravages of time. In some cases, these ships were towed to scrapyards, where they were torn apart for their metal, a process that was both a financial necessity and a sobering symbol of the war's conclusion. Thousands of tons of steel, once forged to create the instruments of destruction, were reduced to scrap. One of the most notable examples of this process was the scuttling of the Prinz Eugen, a heavy cruiser that had survived the war only to be turned into scrap metal in 1947. But the decision to dispose of these ships was not a straightforward one. For many of the Allies, there was a reluctance to simply erase the symbols of Nazi power. Some vessels were kept as trophies of war, symbolic reminders of the defeat of Germany. The Admiral Graf Spee, a pocket battleship for example, had been scuttled after the Battle of the River Plate in 1939, but its wreck was still considered a significant piece of naval history. Similarly, the Scharnhorst, one of the most formidable battleships in the Kriegsmarine, was sunk during the war, but its legacy was kept alive in the collective memory of the Allies. The decision to scrap these ships would not be made lightly, especially in cases where the vessels still held historical value. The problem of disposal was also compounded by economic considerations. Many of the ships that survived the war were still large, and some, like the Admiral Hipper, were relatively modern, with advanced radar and weapons systems that could be utilized for a range of purposes. Yet, as the Allies looked toward the future, there was little interest in maintaining such a large and outdated fleet. The economic costs of preserving these ships for any meaningful use were simply too high. The post-war global economy, in shambles from the war, required the nations to focus their resources on rebuilding, not maintaining unnecessary naval forces. For this reason, most of the surviving ships were either scuttled or sold for scrap. The Allied powers also had to deal with the immense logistical challenge of locating and dismantling these ships. The waters surrounding Germany were still strewn with the wreckage of war, and many of the ships were scattered across the Baltic Sea, the North Sea, and even the Mediterranean. The operation to remove these vessels was a Herculean task, one that would stretch over years, if not decades. As the ships were slowly dismantled, their metal was often sold to pay for the war's immense costs. By the time the 1950s arrived, few remnants of the once proud Kriegsmarine remained intact. Yet, even as the last of the Nazi warships were being scrapped or abandoned, the process of their disposal raised questions that lingered for years. What should be done with these massive monuments to a lost cause? How should the world remember the ships that had once carried the flag of Nazi Germany? The answer, for most, was simple: they would be forgotten, consigned to the bottom of the sea or to the scrapyards of history. But as the years passed, the memories of these ships would begin to fade into the fog of history, leaving behind only the scars of their presence in the post-war world. The true scale of the tragedy, the loss of these ships, was only fully realized when the last of them was torn apart. It wasn't the roar of cannon fire or the sight of plumes of smoke rising over the sea that marked the end of the Nazi warships. It was the quiet, unceremonious cutting of steel, the sound of history being dismantled piece by piece. The post-war disposition of Nazi warships was not merely a logistical challenge, it was an international decision fraught with geopolitical calculations, economic constraints, and deep-seated historical symbolism. While the majority of the surviving Kriegsmarine vessels were scrapped, abandoned, or relegated to museums, some found entirely unexpected futures. The tension between what should be done with these remnants of Nazi power and the practical needs of the post-war world lingered well into the 1950s. As the Allies slowly began dismantling the warships, the British, in particular, faced significant challenges. The Royal Navy, the largest and most powerful of the Allies' fleets, already had its own problems. Rebuilding after the war required not just resources but also strategic decisions about how best to allocate them. Ships like the Tirpitz were massive and expensive to maintain. The Tirpitz, once the pride of the German fleet, had been the subject of numerous raids during the war before being scuttled in 1944. But the decision to scrap her was still one filled with historical significance. The British were well aware that destroying such a symbol of the Nazi regime meant erasing a chapter of naval history that, although associated with terror, had also become iconic. The Tirpitz and her counterparts were more than just weapons. They were the embodiment of Nazi naval engineering, and their destruction felt like an act of finality. In 1948, her wreckage was finally sold for scrap, and her hulking remnants were dragged from Norwegian waters and broken apart, piece by piece, in the shipyards of the United Kingdom. While British and American interests focused on the large warships, smaller vessels, including submarines and destroyers, were disposed of more efficiently. These ships, many of which were in varying states of disrepair after the war, had a simpler fate. They were either dismantled in the wrecking yards of Europe or left to rot in the waters where they had once sailed. The U-boat fleet, the legendary silent hunters of the Atlantic, was similarly scattered to the winds. By 1946, The surviving German submarines were being destroyed in large numbers, often under the direct orders of the Allies. Some of these vessels were scuttled in the Baltic Sea, while others were sold to nations looking for inexpensive scrap metal or raw materials. The submarines, once an emblem of Germany's maritime might, had now become nothing more than rusting relics of a time best forgotten. Yet some ships, especially those that had been taken as war trophies, had a different fate. The French, for example, were one of the few nations that would retain any significant portion of the Kriegsmarine's fleet. The French Navy was keen to incorporate certain German vessels into its own ranks. The most notable case was the Deutschland, the first of the famous Deutschland-class cruisers. After the war, the ship was seized by the French and, with some modifications, brought into service as the Dunkirk. This reuse of Nazi warships wasn't entirely out of a desire for historical preservation but rather out of sheer necessity. France, having suffered greatly during the war, was left with a severely depleted naval force. The Dunkirk, originally a German design, would become part of the French fleet for several years before it too was scrapped. Other vessels, however, faced a more ignoble fate. Some were simply abandoned in ports, left to rot away under the harsh effects of saltwater, their steel hulls corroding away to nothing. The Admiral Hipper, one of the most famous of the German heavy cruisers, was scuttled in 1945. While the Allies had initially intended to preserve it as a war trophy, by the late 1940s, it was decided that the ship would serve no further purpose. By 1948, the Admiral Hipper had been stripped of its valuable parts, and what remained of the ship was sold for scrap. The ship, which had once been a fearsome symbol of the Kriegsmarine, was reduced to little more than a pile of scrap metal. Even in the case of vessels that had been preserved for museums, the fate of these ships was not always secure. The Bismarck, perhaps the most famous of all Nazi warships, had already met a tragic end in 1941, when it was sunk during its maiden voyage. The wreckage, resting on the ocean floor in the North Atlantic, became a symbol of both the power and the fleeting nature of the Kriegsmarine. But the legacy of the Bismarck did not die with the ship. The desire to remember the warship and its fateful demise led to various plans for preservation, including the retrieval of pieces of the wreck for display in museums. By the 1950s, some of these artifacts were pulled from the depths, where they were displayed in exhibits across Europe, allowing the world to remember the might of the Nazi Navy. The desire to preserve the past, however, could not mask the overall sense of loss and futility surrounding the post-war fate of the Nazi warships. Their existence had been defined by violence, destruction, and dominance. Now, in the cold light of post-war Europe, the same ships became symbols of waste, of an era that had ended in catastrophe. The large ships that had once threatened to reshape the geopolitical landscape were now reduced to lifeless hulks or were hastily broken down and sold for parts. The post-war era also saw the transformation of many former German military facilities. The shipyards where these warships had been constructed were repurposed. Many of the shipyards in Kiel, Hamburg, and Wilhelmshaven, which had once produced the mightiest vessels in the Kriegsmarine, were turned to more peaceful uses. In the wake of the war, the German economy was in tatters, and the need for military production had all but evaporated. The post-war years were defined by rebuilding, and the production of warships was far from the minds of most people. Instead, the factories and shipyards began to turn out goods for civilian use. This transition, however, was not without its own complications. In some cases, the same workers who had once built the Nazi warships were now tasked with dismantling them. For many, this was a deeply conflicted process. They had watched as the ships they had built became symbols of national pride, only to see them slowly but inevitably destroyed. As the 1950s wore on, the memory of the Nazi warships began to fade into history. They became distant ghosts, remembered only in the photographs of men who had sailed them and in the occasional museum display. Few people could have foreseen how quickly the mighty Kriegsmarine would become a footnote in the grand narrative of history. Yet for those who had lived through the war, the ships remained powerful symbols of a dark chapter in world history, their fates sealed by the cold, unyielding forces of time, economics, and the desire to move on. By the early 1960s, nearly all of the once proud warships of the Nazi era had been dismantled or forgotten. The few that survived as museum pieces were little more than historical curiosities, their true purpose long lost to the annals of history. As the world moved forward, the German warships that had once held the promise of military supremacy were erased from the global stage. Their metal, once crafted for destruction, was now just a commodity to be repurposed for a new world order. In this quiet, almost sorrowful way, the Nazi warships ceased to exist, not with the thunder of cannons or the roar of the engines, but with the rusting silence of history passing them by. The question then remains, did the warships of the Kriegsmarine ever truly leave the world? Or did their legacy, buried beneath tons of scrap in the passage of time, continue to haunt the waters for years after the war had ended? What happened to these massive vessels wasn't just the end of a fleet, it was the end of an era, the erasure of a power that had once seemed indestructible. The ships that had been built to dominate the oceans were now nothing more than relics, their stories silenced by the inevitable march of time.